I'm going to make some recordings. I better tell who I am. I'm Sherwood Martin. I am 70 years old, and I've been asked to tell some stuff about my life before it's too late. And so I guess today's October 21st, 1999. It's Thursday. And about the only way to remember about my life is to think about places I lived, because that jogs the memory, because we kind of kept moving pretty fast when I was a kid. Quickly, I was born in Brockton, Massachusetts, in a hospital in March 28, 1929, and my parents lived in a little town in Massachusetts called Bryantville, and I don't remember much about Bryantville except that I suppose when we went back there sometime when I was a little older, why, I remember that there was a little white house that we seemed to live in, and that there was a lazy road like there was back in the 1929s and 30s that went by with an occasional car on it, and the grass from the lawn grew down over the edge of the road. And if you walked down the road a little while, the only thing I remember is there were some neighbors that we called Kills, my sister and I, but their name was Kilbriths. And they, in Depression times, tried to make a little extra money by having a kind of fruit and berry turnover stand by the road. And one time I remember getting a turnover. That's about it for Bryantville. And then I know we moved on to big town, big old whaling town of New Bedford, Massachusetts. And my father was going to theological seminary then, and I don't know, the Depression hit in 1929, and he was walking in the rain and got a terrible mastoid operation had to take place. But somehow he kept on running a church they gave him there, a big one in the city of New Bedford, Massachusetts, and he kept going to theological seminary, and he survived the operation, and might have damaged him some, I guess, a little bit. He didn't have the memory he had before, they say. Pretty hard thing. But anyway, they had driven back through the Rockies with my sister in 1927 or 28, I guess, in a Model T, a 1927 Model T, I guess, and so that he could go to Boston University School of Theology, called BUST. I guess it was one of the big ones back then. And how the heck he managed it, I don't know, but I do know that when he was in the Army in World War I, he was in a hospital, and some doctor came along and says, "Hey, soldier," he says, "how would you like to go to college?" And my dad says, "I can't go to college." The doctor says, "Why not?" My father says, "Because I haven't graduated from high school." I mean, imagine some kid from a little town in Roundup, Montana, living off on a ranch in the middle of the winter, going to high school in Roundup, Montana. So anyway, I don't know how it worked out, but he somehow ended up in Seattle and went to a night school of some kind, got a high school diploma, and went to the University of Washington, moved on to some other college in Montana, and then became kind of a semi-ordained minister in a little place where my sister was born called St. Ignatius. And then God knows how he moved on to the east, legitimized himself as a minister, and ended up being back in the East Coast for 13 years. I'll try to tell about some of the towns that I lived in then. I'll stop this thing though and see if anything's coming out. Well, anyway, as the beginning at least one of the Shakespeare plays, the guy that comes out in front on the stage in the beginning says from Shakespeare, "What's past is prologue." So I guess that's kind of how my father anyway is prologue sort of. And haven't said much about my sister Barbara or my mother Dorothy, or even my father's name Roland, but I think I'll let that go, and maybe some of those things will come up later, and we have moved on to New Bedford, Massachusetts. Anyway, and I guess we must have been in New Bedford for 3 years till I was, I guess, 4 or 5. And what I can remember about New Bedford is probably about 2 things. One is that every summer the circus parade went right down our street, right in front of our house, with all the stuff you can think of, the steam calliope and the clowns and the elephants and all the women that did funny, acrobatic stunts on top of animals, and pretty much the whole shooting match, all the cages with lions and whatnot. I remember that. And about the other thing I remember about it is also the old streetcar used to rumble past the front of the house with its wicker seats, and sometimes, I don't know if they all had open sides or not, but at least some of them. And I can remember riding on them with my mother. I always liked the kind of interesting, groan or roar that they made as they kind of start up, and then they kind of go back again when they slow down, and you could see the guy with his hand on the control arm. And liked riding on the streetcar. But as far as there was anything else to New Bedford, I really can't remember it. And I guess that takes us to Wellfleet out on Cape Cod, still in Massachusetts. And remember, of course, a little more about that. I went to first grade there. There wasn't kindergarten. I remember kind of kicking around and wondering what to do the year that I would like to have been in kindergarten, but they had closed it down, probably depression-related thing. Anyway, school wasn't much fun. I didn't like it. Great big sea of desks with many, many students and one teacher, and I don't know, didn't care much for it at all, but there I was in first grade. In fact, I was only through first grade there. But I remember a lot of other stuff about Wellfleet. And that is, again, a sleepy little place. It was an oyster town by then, really. And, of course, the Cape is just a long spit of sand that curves out into the Atlantic and kind of catches the North Atlantic to some degree. And actually, I remember going down to the beach, and there the tourists that were long gone now. There wasn't much of anybody coming, and there were miles and miles of just golden coarse sand. And the tide would come in gradually through the great big Cape Cod Bay, which actually collected the water not from the north but from the south, which was nice. And then the water, incoming tides, would be brought even more narrowly into the little Wellfleet Bay, and by the time it would reach the shore across the gentle sand, it was nice and warm, and it was a wonderful place to swim in. When we were little, we'd get down there with my mother, sometimes my father. I remember very nicely swimming down there. And I don't know, we lived in a White House across from the doctor on one corner and the undertaker on the other. And, there were other kids there, and but it wasn't a very active life, but it was a very nice one, kind of a neat place to live. And after we moved away from there, for at least 4 or 5 years, we'd go back there for probably 3 or 4 weeks every summer and live in one of these large but rough cabins that wealthy people had down there. They just let us use because nobody was vacationing much in the Depression, I guess. And they were great big empty places that were really mostly bare wood. But I think that was part of the charm of them. It was just so comfortable and easy to live in there with nothing but some rather sandblasted and sea air tinged big old empty wooden houses with long wooden steps down to the beach. I think that's my image of Cape Cod, except for the fact that I remember one winter of, gosh, I don't know which year, but something like 1934, 35, I suppose, the year that the ice jammed into Cape Cod, really into Wellfleet Bay, and took out the great big old, what had been empty for years, kind of a resort hotel built way out on pilings that also had fallen on bad times and been abandoned during the Depression. And the other thing is that walking along with my father and my sister one cold day down along the beach, there was a place where the bay water came in under the causeway the little road was built on and filled up quite a good-sized pond on the shore side. Frozen up solid, but it was smooth ice. There was a guy out there with an ice boat that he'd made, just pretty much a rugged cross of timber with skates and a sail on it, and we all went for a ride, and it was just fantastic. Rumbling along with the wind going through the guy wires and hearing the skates on the ice. Never forgot it, always wanted to do it again myself sometime. Actually, I shouldn't say we all went for a ride on that little ice boat. It was a one-at-a-time sort of thing, but great ride, man. I tell you, the wind go pretty fast on a pair of skates with the wind blowing. That was a different experience. So, also some other stuff about the Cape. Not two things, actually. One year, a bunch of small whales got trapped in Wellfleet Bay and ran up on the ground in the summertime and couldn't get away, and you could hear them crying out there all night long for nights because they were drying up in the heat and couldn't get back into the water for whatever reason. They'd come in, no one knew. All the guys would go out in boats of every kind, try to drive them out, but it did no good, and they came ashore and beached themselves, and then they would die, and they would heat up and they would explode, and then they would stink for weeks and weeks and weeks, and there was nothing you could do. But in earlier years, when the Pilgrims had been there, the Pilgrims having settled not for the first year or so in Plymouth Rock at all, hadn't landed on Plymouth Rock at all, but way up the north tip of the Cape, in Provincetown, when the whales would come in, it was a wonderful thing because they could go out and put a stake in their whale and claim them for the oil. So maybe there was some other kind of thing like that about the Cape. I know. There were lighthouses here and there on the Cape. And one of them was the second biggest on the Atlantic coast, I believe. It was called Highland Light, and a very powerful lighthouse. We'd go up there occasionally, but the picnics, that was the back shore that had, instead of the warm sand and warm water and everything, the heavy breakers and the cold water, and rather dangerous from the North Atlantic coming in, and but you go down below the bluffs and have enormous bonfires of driftwood, sit out there in the night, whole families, and cook hot dogs and have a picnic and then have marshmallows and so on, and then we'd all troop back, and I can remember being carried on my father's shoulder at night because I was too tired to walk. And one day, my father and I went I think it was a place called Cahoon's Hollow. I don't think it was at Highland Light at all. And there was a place where the, what would they have been? I guess the Coast Guard, and I don't know if there was any Coast Guard auxiliary or not, but had a rescue station. And they would shove these old-style surf-type lifeboats that worked with oars out into the surf on great big steel wheels, jump in and go rowing out against the big breakers out to rescue people from supposed sea wrecks out there. And shortly after we'd moved away, when World War II came along, there were many such incidents because the Germans were just wiping out merchant ships close in all up and down the Atlantic coast. And a doctor across the street, for example, one night was called out in the middle of the night, put in one of those boats and rowed out to take care of the terribly burned crew on one of the boats. But on this particular day that we went up there, they were just having a nice daytime practice, and I guess I must have been 5 or so, and they said, Sherwood, would you like to ride in the Breeches Boy? And I didn't know what it was, but they put me up on a tower, and the Breeches Boy is a thing that you shoot from one ship to another, from shore to ship, and it's a pair of canvas pants, actually, shorts. And they shoot across the line to the other ship with a pulley on it, using a cannon. And then the guys on the other end grab it and get up, and you've got a line on pulleys, and you pull people one at a time off the ship in the canvas pair of shorts onto the high tower on the safe side. And they sent me shooting out across there, and caught me up on the other tower and sent me back again. One of the great experiences of my young life. Well, I guess Barbara, my sister, and I must have liked Cape Cod pretty well because we were pretty bummed out when we finally had to move, but it was the nature of being a Methodist minister back in those years, and I guess maybe still is, that in general they keep circulating the ministers from church to church, and you move every 2, 3, 4 years, and so about 3 years was up, and they sent my father on to another parish, and this time in Connecticut. Somehow, Barbara and I weren't ready for that. We kind of liked the Cape, and had heard that the house, though a great big one up in Stafford Springs, Connecticut, was yellow, and she couldn't stand the idea of a yellow house. And a lot of times, her opinions that time, she was 18 months older than me, influenced me quite a bit. So I had a pretty negative impression of moving to Stafford Springs, Connecticut, but move we did, and showed up, and here's this great big yellow house and a great big yard. Kind of nice, really, but first thing I remember about the town really was walking down the tar sidewalk as a little kid, summer before 2nd grade, and saw another little kid down there. And he looked kind of pear-shaped, kind of olive-looking, and a little on the heavy side, but he looked to be about my age. And I said, well, what's your name? And he says, Mitchell Sirua. I said, Sirua? He says, no, Sirua. I said, what do you mean? It sounds like Sirua. No, Sirua. Well, I found out later that his name was Siror, but he had kind of the pronunciation of more of a kid out of somewhere in New York than would have seemed like a typical accent from Connecticut. But anyway, he became my close friend. His parents were Syrians, and I was trying to straighten that out. I said, so you're Assyrian? No, not Assyrian, just plain Syrian. And I couldn't really understand that, but I took his word for it. But for 4 years, he became my buddy. He lived down the street. They ran a grocery store. And my first job was helping Mitchell back in the big old bin of potatoes in the back of the store, filling up bags with potatoes to set out on the shelves for sale. And potatoes were then sold by bushels and pecks. And we were filling up pecks of potatoes, and we'd get a choice of a nickel candy bar after we're done. And boy, that was a big time thing. We were working and getting paid. As might be expected, I wasn't heavily into school. The schools back then weren't really a whole heck of a lot of fun. I mean, they were strict and big old rooms where there were a lot of kids and one teacher, and there wasn't much individual attention. But seemed to work out okay. But I remember one of the things that about me was that teachers would say, well, Sherwood's a daydreamer. Well, heck, by then I guess the Batman and Superman had come along, and I had a wonderful capability of flying out windows and doing all kind of stuff during school. So I did learn long division, for whatever they had, I guess, by the time I got out of 5th grade. But I don't think school holds a huge lot of information about Stafford Springs, Connecticut. But what the heck does? Oh, well, yeah, we lived on a hill with tar sidewalks, pretty steep hill, and when you got roller skates, you could go skating pretty fast down the hill, but it wasn't like concrete because there's too darn many cracks that you're always jumping over all the time. But that was one of the things we did anyway. Did a bit of roller skating. It's also good for riding down the big old sidewalk for blocks and blocks in a wagon, or on a scooter, which I liked very much. I had a scooter. I really liked that. Scooter was probably one of my favorite toys, actually. But and in the wintertime, yeah, snow. And we had some wonderful fast sledding. Now that was terrific, and occasionally make great big igloos and stuff. So snow was wonderful, and also in the fall. You always hear about these wonderful New England falls with the leaves just so scarlet and orange and yellow, all up and down the streets all over town, and then they'd fall. And all up and down the streets, everybody would have raked their yards. And other than the great big piles we made to drop into from clothesline posts and whatnot as kids, they all eventually got raked out into the gutters in front of all the houses, all over town, up and down the streets. And at night, people would set their leaves on fire and burn them, and the air was heavy with smoke. But that kind of changed a little bit when, in 1938, one of the big hurricanes of all time struck. And I might say before that, my brother Edgar had been born in 1937, and so he was kind of my little buddy. And the morning he was born, I was called from the hospital, and somehow I had a pan of water heating on the stove. I don't know what I was doing with it. Maybe making mush or something. I was so excited, I picked the pan by its handle up in the air and dumped it down my back. Couldn't have been too hot because I just got a little bit red, but not really scalded. Funny thing about that. But, yeah, the hurricane was wonderful. The wind started to blow, and we were running out, getting the clothes off the line and picking up junk that was out there. We didn't know there was any hurricane coming. Nobody knew it. No prediction. And toys were blowing around. We got stuff collected. And gosh, it was getting worse. My dad said, well, I better go over to the church. It was a pretty big place over there with an old style with probably 2 or 3 brick chimneys on it and a high steeple. And he said, I better shut the shutters on there. He goes over there, and we're looking at him out the window. He comes back out, and these probably 4 stories high brick chimneys falls in front of him, and the other in back of him. He's walking up across the embankment over the yard, and one maple tree falls in front of him and another one in back of him. These are like big old 100-year-old maple trees. He walks on in the house, and another tree slams into the top of the house and stoves in one of the windows up there. But the wonderful thing about the hurricane, oh gosh, what an excellent thing. It made a jungle out of the town, and wild animals moved in at night. They couldn't tell where they were, and there were no lights anywhere. You know, the electricity was out for, God, I guess, at least a couple of weeks, and there was no school. And just kids out there playing in this jungle land. It was fantastic. Guess what surprised us most in watching the trees go down? Never occurred to us that the roots would pop up almost as high as the trees. So that was a big fun thing. And then, of course, that was accompanied by a flood, which cut the town in two with this raging water. And I'm sure I've told this story 1,000 times, but Barbara and I were walking down, watching the flood right through the middle of town. And since the juice was out, why, the ice cream store on the other side of the flood couldn't keep the ice cream cold, and they were handing out actual quarts of every kind of ice cream to the kids on the other side of town. And we couldn't get there. And back then, ice cream wasn't no everyday thing. I like to climb trees there in Stafford Springs because there are a lot of trees that were just great for climbing. I was always climbing up into some kind of a tree. Had one favorite one out in the yard, pretty big maple tree actually, and I can remember hanging from a branch way up in the top of the thing, and some woman screaming at me, "You get down from there right now." I guess she must have been scared to death, but yeah, tree climbing was a wonderful and big thing back in New England, especially there in Stafford Springs. But that didn't last either. We did 4 years there. Wasn't a bad 4 years, actually. And it was time to move on again. We went to a little town of Washington, Rhode Island. Another big old house with lots of, actually, acreage. And they had outbuildings, a great big old empty barn now with nothing in it, and wash shed, and really an old-style New England place. Wash shed, a wood shed, and all that sort of thing. And so we lived there for a year, and again, there were a lot of good New England things, especially the wintertime sledding was just excellent there, thing which I loved, which reminds me of something back on the Cape. Our house was at the top of a hill on a lane, and if you went down the lane, don't think there were any houses down there, the bottom of the lane was Snapping Turtle Pond. And in the winter, Snapping Turtle Pond froze over good and solid. And you could sit down with your skates on in our kind of, what do you call it? Kind of a rough back room where you put on your winter clothes and stuff like that. And we put on our stuff there, sit down on the sled, and just zip down onto Snapping Turtle Pond, and sled would shoot clear out across the pond, and then you go skating down there, and that was a heck of a lot of fun. We really liked that. My parents had skates too, and yeah, that was back in Wellfleet, and that was another big thing. But anyway, we're living in. I got us back to Washington, Rhode Island now. Big old house, and this big old farm-like place, really, with another field just completely empty next to it. And in those years, Navy planes would come over, and they were training planes, and they were open biplanes, Stinsons, actually. Oh, not Stinsons. What were those planes? I don't know why I can't think of it. An obvious kind of plane that everybody knows about that were just terrific. I'd still like to have one. Big old biplanes, and they'd put the planes into spins over the field next door. The first time Barbara and I ever saw them doing this, we had heard that you couldn't ever get out of a spin when you started one, but that was not true. They had long since learned to do that, and that was one of the exciting things about that town. But it also had a swimming hole that was a good place in the summer, and the family would walk up there, and other families and kids would be there, and we'd go swimming well, it was a dam that dammed a little river up, And the dam was for the textile. All the textile mills originally had their own dams, and the main thing was to simply not get washed over the dam, but it didn't move too fast, and we never got washed over the dam, though my mother once had to ask for some help from some teenage boys because she wasn't making it too well. But yeah, that was a great thing about there. It wasn't too bad of a town either, but my dad got into some kind of debates with the town mayor, who was a scoundrel, and thought, the heck with it, I'm not staying here anymore, I'm not playing your game, and he decided it was time to get back to Montana. Both of my parents did. And they thought they saw the war coming and all. And I guess they thought they'd get back to their roots, and so they pulled up stakes after a year, and we headed to a little town of Hobson, Montana. The Montana years begin. And that little town of Hobson had 160 people in it. And my dad was what you call a circuit rider. Went back to the days of the early Methodist church, where guys went out on horseback and to little places and carried the Bible and the Word out to the people. And that's pretty much he was doing that there, except that in Montana he had a 1932 Buick. And I was 12 years old and got to drive him out to these remote parishes across the plains, where in the summertime the point of driving was to keep the tires out of the dried up mud ruts, because if you got in them you couldn't get out. If you got in them they'd tear up the tires. And in the wintertime the job was to stay the heck in the ruts so you didn't get stuck in the packed snow. And you sure as heck didn't want to get packed in by a blizzard. But we'd go out to these forsaken little places across the prairie with names like Utica and Garneal, Straw, Moccasin, I don't know what all. And years later, when I went back in 1996, I think it was, to kind of revisit Hobson, the people that had now souped up the church, even though the town was smaller. Religion has become popular in the 90s, not unlike it had been in earlier years. But they only knew of 3 or 4 places that the old circuit rider had been. But back then it was a great opportunity to drive a car, and I enjoyed it very much. Well, if you don't mind too much, if I drop back to New England a bit here, I just remembered something about that too. Remember one time in Stafford Springs, Connecticut, I must have been maybe somewhere between 10 and 11 years old, I'm guessing. I don't know. A friend of mine, probably Albert Belanger, I suppose, I can't remember who, from the tenant buildings in back of us there. We just used to head out sometimes out of town, as you could do then. And funny around those New England towns, but, you know, you didn't run into another town or a bunch of houses, or just kind of wander out through meadows and sometimes a swamp or something, and through little places that were kind of brushy or bushy, maybe blueberry bushes and stuff. Just keep wandering out into the countryside without any knowledge of what we were really doing. And on one occasion, we, for example, came to a good-sized pond, I guess you'd call it. And so, as we did in those days, we just kind of looked around the edge of the pond, because there would be a rowboat or a kind of little scow or something around there somewhere. And sure enough, we came up with one. Nobody around, the whole lake, just empty. And old scow, probably hadn't been used for years anyway. And found some boards or pieces of paddle, push out into the pond, paddle around for a while, go swimming. In fact, that had to be the summer of 1938. Must have been the fall, because the blueberries were out. And, I had fallen out of a tree earlier and broken my wrist. Had it in a cast for a while and taken it out, so it was kind of weak. But decided to swim across the pond for some reason, and I didn't realize how weak that arm was, and I just couldn't make it anymore. And I started going down, and I guess we ditched the boat by then, and son of a gun, my feet settled on the ground. I was far enough across to be in the shallows, and and walked on to the other side. But a bit of luck. But it was the story's more to illustrate the nature of what you could do out of a New England town. How really empty it was around the edges. Kind of a neat place. Barbara and I used to go out to visit a place a couple of miles or so from home occasionally, and along the way we'd walk across the top of a kind of a slippery dam and hope we didn't fall off. But oh yeah, that was the nature. In fact, the next town we went to, I told about earlier, Washington, Rhode Island. Some friend and I, again, we didn't live there long enough I can remember who it was even, but just started walking out one, I suppose, summer day just to see where we ended up. And I remember coming to a place where there was an old ramshackle building which had once been a little a mill of some kind. And the old dilapidated wooden wheel still kind of creaked around a little bit, and the paddle wheel. And we walk into this little old mill, they say dilapidated, and somewhere on maybe a first story, or might have been a sort of a second story, I don't remember. Probably just a first, because it seemed to be built over a kind of a falls, and we'll look down into a rectangular, maybe 5 foot across hole that was permanently in the floor there. With, I think there might have been some rickety siding around to keep you from falling in. Look down 25 maybe feet or so. Dark, but you could see down in there. And there was this almost perfectly smooth water running under there, but you could see it was with an intense speed, a real mill race. And I remember looking down thinking, my God, don't fall down the hole. But, that was an attractive kind of a nuisance that people didn't seem to worry about then. The kids would just go out through the really rather empty New England countryside and stumble upon things. Or maybe I'm wrong about that, actually. Maybe, I don't remember ever seeing any other kids doing that. Don't remember running into any other people in such ventures, actually. In fact, skipping years ahead to Seattle, Washington, probably in about 1949 then, I remember that the whole downtown, a lot of the downtown waterfront was big old rickety empty buildings, which pretty much ignored in the same way, and nobody cared. Remember with a friend wandering downtown one time, George Saltman and I, wandering through the big old warehouses that faced out on the Sound. And they're not too different, I guess, from the old buildings I just described, except a heck of a lot bigger. Remember opening about a fourth story or third story, gosh, I don't know, door to the outside in a big old downtown waterfront Seattle probably processing place or warehouse or something, and just opening the door and there was nothing there, no stairs, no barrier, nothing. First step was a big one. Well, go back and try Montana again, that's in a way a tough one. There's a tendency to want to describe the open plains, I guess, of Montana, which is really my experience, as opposed to the mountains in the west. And I guess since you've seen it, I don't need to describe it. I don't know what it has to do with my life experience or particular things I might have done, but somehow, well, they call it the Big Sky Country, which I never would have thought of, but that big open expanse somehow has an effect on your life that is kind of interesting. I guess you have to have seen it to understand it. But I talked about driving the car out across it, which was one thing. And it seemed like in most places you can look forever and still see the mountains. You can remember the fact that everybody knows that there's no point in exaggerating, that it can get pretty darn cold and so on. Summers can be pretty dry, but I somehow have a fascination for that big, empty, brown expanse, and now, anyway, the empty, big old grain elevators that sit there with no purpose. I do remember driving a grain truck when I was a kid. Take this 2-ton, a ton and a half farm stake bed truck, load of grain, and you'd drive around the field next to the combine. It would still be going. You'd stand out on the running board with one foot maybe inside, hit the brake or the accelerator or something just to keep in line with a chute that was pouring the grain out into the back of your truck. And when it was full, you'd toss the canvas over it and drive into town and drive up into one of the grain elevators, and you'd drive in over a metal grating, stop the truck, and the guys in the grain elevator would come and pull back your little gate and your tailgate until you got some of the grain out, and then they'd pull back the big one. And, well, or did they? I don't know, I guess they did. But what would happen is you drive in there, and this grate just tips you up at a very steep angle. You're sitting in the cab looking up kind of at the ceiling of the grain elevator, and they dump the grain out through the metal grating and put it down, give you a receipt, and drive out. And then they'd be always using their bucket system, what do we call it, conveyor belt with buckets to haul it up to the top, and then it would shoot out into the trains in those days. Of course, they don't do that anymore. I have to stop and think about what they do, but actually it doesn't matter at this point. Well, anyway, earlier I was talking about our first town in Montana, which was Hobson. And I do remember some things about Hobson. I guess I'll start with a little wintertime memory. One time, Barbara and I woke up. I don't know if Edgar was up or the rest of the family. I think it was just the two of us looking out the upstairs window. And it had snowed during the night. And it was, one of those dry, cold, soft snows. Kind of sift down in there. Hadn't settled down, it was just fluff on the ground, but we had a dog that was just about knee-high when standing on all fours, a little less, Tigger. And we looked out the window, and here is Tigger. Well, you got to picture the town, it isn't very much. And there's a dirt or gravel road going by the front of our house, and perfectly straight lines, and so here's the dog out in the road, except you can't see the road because it snowed about up to the dog's chin when the dog's standing on all fours. And Tigger is just desperately running along with her chin, plowing the top of the snow, feathery top of the snow, as hard as she can go, and just having an awful time. But every ounce of energy into it. And up ahead, maybe, I'm guessing, 30 feet or something like that, there's a jackrabbit, which you would expect would be jumping as they tend to do from this corner to that corner, the other corner, but it was plopping down into the snow, almost disappearing, plopped straight up again ahead, land down right smack as tight as it could go down the center of the road, as if it had some kind of a course all set, and it couldn't jump but straight ahead. and Tigger staying right behind it as hard as she could go. The jackrabbit goes on down the road for quite a long distance, and there's a road that hangs a right. And of all things, the jackrabbit goes right to the center of the next road, hangs a right, and continues down the center of the next road. And the dog goes to the last rabbit post hole that's put in the snow and hangs a right down the center of the road behind the jackrabbit. Nobody seemed to take any evasive steps or cut any corners. Funniest darn thing, that dog hopelessly chasing that jackrabbit, which I guess eventually disappeared off up the hill and out of town into the prairies. Another thing I remember about Hobson, Montana, I always wanted to be a Boy Scout, but we were moving so fast that I wanted to be an Eagle Scout, top, but you got to get all the merit badges, and there has to be a troop. And turned out in Hobson, Montana, there was, in fact, a scout troop, which I guess I must have joined it, but it was quite a good scout troop when you think about it, because there wasn't any this paramilitaristic stuff with uniforms and all that kind of junk. But the only thing that I remember that we ever did was, the only summer, and the first summer that I was there, some guy said, "Hey, you want to go on our scout trip?" I said, "Sure." So we'd take blankets, we'd make up our bedrolls. Sleeping bags seemed to be pretty much unknown or unused or something like that then. We knew how to make up really good bedrolls and made those up, and I suppose, I don't know if we had any packs or not, but I suppose we did. Grabbed some old fishing poles, nothing special, just a reel and line, a handle, and whatever needed. We got some food together, and they put, I guess, 4 or 5 of us